As someone who has a channel purely based around visual novels, it should come as no surprise that I consider the visual novel medium my all-time favorite. I even have an older video where I list my top 10 reasons why I love visual novels so much. All that reasoning still applies to this day. However, I do enjoy other mediums sometimes, but I just generally find others to be much more inconsistent compared to visual novels that tend to be my go-to for more guaranteed enjoyment with different genres. In this video, I'm going to cover why I think visual novels are my favorite storytelling medium, specifically to compare specific traits of why I like them more on average compared to other mediums. One of the go-to main reasons I always say I love visual novels is there's almost a guaranteed conclusion to every story. Admittedly, there are some exceptions like episodic stories or visual novels written by Kinugasa like Meteor World Actor or Akatsuki no Goei. But for the most part, whether it's a romance story, a mystery story, a psychological story, there is at least a 95% chance there's going to be a conclusion to at least one route, if not the whole story in each visual novel released. Unfortunately, this cannot be said for the vast majority of other storytelling mediums, especially in the current time. One of my previous favorite mediums, anime, is one that I've gotten sick and tired of over time, mostly because of its seasonal format. I've grown more and more bitter that there are so many shows that are likely to just only have one, maybe two seasons purely because it didn't get popular enough, or they just pull the read the source material card. So you're kind of forced to find the original manga or light novel, which then themselves aren't guaranteed to have been done by the time the anime ends. This issue gets doubled for battle shonen and certain long-running romance shows. I like me some good action or good romance, but the amount of ways authors will try to pad out their action romance stories is just incredibly frustrating, and it ruins the pacing of anime, manga, and light novel-driven stories, especially since you have to wait at least a week between anime episodes and, depending on the manga or light novel, could be between a week or even a month. Naturally, this seasonal issue is something common with Western media shows as well. The ever so growing popular use of seasonal shows with long waits in between is part of why I'm hesitant to even start popular ones that actually interest me. For example, people praised the hell out of Game of Thrones while it was airing and when it was actually following the book material, but once it reached the final seasons where the show adapters decided to make bad fanfiction, that kind of vindicated one of my personal favorite things to do. Always wait for a story to be complete before hyping it up. There's so many long-running stories that either go too long or have disappointing endings, and it's especially bad for long-running shows where they hype up the audience month to year-long waits between seasons. With visual novels though, you generally do not have to worry about that. Most routes have a satisfying conclusion, with the occasional supplementary and not necessary sequels or fandiscs when needed. On a side note, I personally never subscribe to FOMO or fear of missing out. Generally, if I want to watch or play something, I'll do it when I want. It can be as early as when it comes out, when it fully releases, or even several years after people stop talking about it. I get part of why people do FOMO due to tribal instincts and liking the idea of talking about stuff with people while it's hot. To me, a truly timeless piece of media is only worth if you can experience it long after it's not popular anymore and you can still discuss it with people and or just enjoy it personally, privately. Since most visual novels get translated years after they originally released in Japan, that ends up what's happening anyway, which works perfectly with my mindset. The next point I'm going to bring up is the visual novel medium being the best of all worlds in terms of presentation. Some of my favorite mediums growing up included anime, video games, and books. Visual novels generally have the best of all of these. Japanese ones tend to have an anime-like aesthetic, and I've always liked the look of anime, as well as just the generally pretty good Japanese voice acting. Again, something I liked hearing in Japanese subbed anime growing up. Visual novels from a technical standpoint are video games. So visual novels having the UI of having a text box on the bottom, save and load features is always nice, since it's easy to save where you are at, as opposed to reading a real-life book where you have to get a physical bookmark of some sort, or in a non-visual novel video game where you can generally only save in certain locations. And of course, since visual novels are, well, novels, the huge amount of text means they take after books, so they have to time to build out their descriptions of settings, stories, and characters. As someone who has a terrible imagination, being able to see what's happening with all the descriptions and voice dialogue makes taking what I would get from a real book more palatable, making visual novels that much more enjoyable to read. I like me some anime, but sometimes I just want to go at my own pace and being able to enjoy jokes and romance whatever I want, especially if I want to take a break to get water so I don't have to wait for 15 to 20 minutes for an anime episode to end or press spacebar to pause and play, especially since I like to skip openings in anime anyway, and visual novels makes that really easily unless they're just not skippable for some reason. Manga and light novels generally do not have audio or visual coloring in their stories, so I'm generally less likely to check out those mediums. While I don't mind a Western story every now and then, I will admit as a self-proclaimed weeb, I tend to favor the anime aesthetic these days. The next section is admittedly less about my personal tastes and more about the potential in visual novels. I noticed visual novels tend to be more willing to break the mold, as visual novels tend to be 18 plus PC releases by default. There's a lot darker themes that they can get away with compared to other mediums that generally have to appeal to a wider audience. When you have stuff like Gore Screaming Show, Euphoria, the one by Clock Up, not the one with Zendaya, and basically anything by Nitro Plus, shows that it's possible for a story to both be popular, but also go in a really unique, dark direction that most mediums wish they could follow. That's not to say that other mediums haven't done unique, dark storytelling stuff before. Certain psychological anime like Death Parade, One Outs, and Hellgirl are some of my all-time favorites because of how unique and different they are. Western movies like Fight Club are popular for a reason, because of how purposefully trippy it gets while still being memorable and engaging. But I just find visual novels are more willing to be more experimental and somehow still get popular. Though admittedly, I'm personally less likely to read certain stories that go too far. You will likely not see me finish Subahibi, nor will you see me even come close to starting something up like Sadistic Blood or Dead End Aegis. But it's just really nice to know that through the visual novel medium, dark, weird, or unique stories like this can exist in some way, and can still exist alongside the more traditional lighthearted romance and badass action stories. Going into a more subjective point, visual novels in general tend to have the type of genres I personally prefer. As said above, I really like psychological stories or visual novels full of character-driven stories that get surprisingly deep. I also tend to really like mystery stories that make you question what's really going on all the way up until the final route, which tends to have really intense, mind-blowing reveals. But of course, I also just like some wholesome slice-of-life romance, especially ones that have a decent amount of goofy, wacky comedy. Some of my all-time favorite visual novels basically consist of the three genres I just listed, and they can exist in other mediums. But I just find it's a lot harder to find these personal favorites in non-visual novel mediums. For example, I used to be something of a big JRPG fan, but over time, I just kind of got sick of the fantasy setting and felt like I got most of what the setting was offering by the late 2000s or early 2010s. It's part of why I can't even get into stuff like popular modern fantasy anime like Frieren and Konosuba. While I mentioned a handful of psychological and mystery anime and western stories I liked earlier in the video, that's basically the extent of ones that I found that I liked or was even remotely interested in. In visual novels, there's plenty of stories that can somehow weave in good romance with psychological stuff within the same story. Most other mediums usually stick to one or the other. As for the romance genre, oh boy, that's gonna need its own section. So let's do just that. Talk about how visual novels actually have generally good resolved romance. While all the non-visual novel mediums I mentioned up until now tended to only be relevant for certain sections, if there's one thing every other non-visual novel medium that generally aggravates me is most romance series are really bad at resolving or cliche at resolving the romance stories. Now I get it, the hype of seeing a built-up couple get together is fun, and if done right, can be one of my favorite stories ever, like with Toradora generally being a go-to of something I personally really like. However, there's only so much I can take before I'm just sick of seeing the thrill of seeing a couple get together. Anime is always one of my go-to mediums to complain about this. The amount of good stories where the couple gets together long before the ending can be counted on maybe one or two hands, and the ones where they do get together seem to purposefully not try to develop their relationship well at all. As far as modern popular anime goes, I like to particularly critique two series that show how far anime romance has disappointed me. Kaguya-sama Love is War and the Quintessential Quintuplets. For Kaguya-sama, immediately, part of it is I'm not super into its goofy comedy, but even if I dig like more parts of it, I just hate the idea of at least half or more of the premise being that the reason the main couple are not together is that they're just so competitive of getting the other to confess first. They could easily have gotten the couple together and still have them be competitive for another and have actual good development instead of just being a crappy, long, drawn-out romance. Visual novel companies like Minato Soft, SME, Asa Project, and Krupo show you can still have hilarious banter long after a couple gets together, so why couldn't Kaguya do it? As for the Quintessential Quintuplets, just shows that people are so willing to keep the harem genre going that they have to make up a really dumb premise where the protagonist has the ability to get with one of 5 sisters who were born at the same time, yet have different personalities and interests, but still look similar enough, yet different. And then of course, it takes at least several seasons and a movie for the main protagonist to get with one of the girls, and when he finally chooses, fans consider the series over. These are all the tropes I hate about anime harem-style romance. The Quintessential Quintuplets is probably a fine enough show in terms of romance and character development. However, Quintuplets to me just shows how weeb writers and fans are stuck in this Stockholm syndrome of being only able to enjoy seeing the story of a couple potentially getting together and can't imagine enjoying anything else, at least in terms of romance. Funnily enough though, I find that Western media has the opposite problem. For some reason in the West, there are so many stories where aren't even romance heavy like The Office, where the problem isn't necessarily if a couple will get together, The drama is more of how willing people are able to switch around which person they're going out with per season. This is the exact type of drama that would piss me off in real life. And the fact that people get enjoyment out of seeing people essentially switching partners with each other constantly is not something I want to see, and I generally avoid Western shows like How I Met Your Mother that have a lot of romance elements like this. In a way, visual novels cover exactly what I want in terms of romance. There's just enough buildup and progression to get emotionally invested in the romance, and generally speaking, the couple gets together by the early middle of the actual route, and usually there's enough emotional and character development in the route outside some story-heavy cases where romance isn't the focus like Dies Irae, Muramasa, and Baldr Sky. However, I'll still take those romances over the bad anime and Western TV romance tropes I mentioned previously any day. As a quick side note, waifu husband awards are dumb, and when visual novels literally let you pick your own winner, so you don't have to get salty in that regard. Moving on. The next point, which I think is one of the most important, are visual novels' more varied and, in my opinion, better use of length and pacing. I know one of the common complaints of getting into visual novels is the fact that many tend to be slow, and to that extent I can agree, although I think this only applies to more extreme cases like how things like Umineko, Muramasa, and the Fruit of Grisaya are way too slow for their own good, while some shorter visual novels like Planetarian or episodic titles are just way too fast. However, I find that most visual novels within that 10 to 40 hour range tend to be just right. Generally, my ideal for a story is to have time to get to know the characters and the setting while still having that guaranteed conclusion, as I mentioned in the first section of this video. Unfortunately, in most mediums, I find that they tend to stick to one extreme in terms of deciding the length and pacing of a story. For example, in general, I'm not into standalone movies of any kind. Movies are a medium that lasts between 1.5 to 2 hours per film. To me, that's barely enough time to just get a story going, let alone get emotionally invested in the characters. Generally, my all-time favorite movies are usually part of a series like Star Wars, The Matrix, or Harry Potter, since they have more time to flesh out the characters and the world, and I very rarely like full standalone movies as one of my all-time favorite media, purely because I almost never get emotionally attached to the characters enough. Long-running anime, manga, and Western TV shows have the exact opposite problem. Not only are they long, not only are they separated by seasons, usually with a 6-month to a year wait between seasons, but many times the author makes huge genre or character changes to make things quote-unquote exciting. This can work sometimes. For example, I personally like the time skip from original Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z, as it got more action heavy, and I like the Star Wars The Clone Wars series because we already have a set timeline, so certain goals and events have to be balanced in order to be met when we get to Revenge of the Sith. However, there's many other cases where I heavily disliked the direction the series went on as it got longer. For example, Naruto pre-time skip was one of my all-time favorite series because it blended ninja strategy and character development pretty well. However, the time skip slowly started to ruin things with introducing way too many characters and barely developing or outright ruining older characters, and the series just becoming a series of fantasy magic and beast fights instead of, ninjas. Long-running shows are also why I generally don't like how most genres have to find a way to pad out ways to have quote-unquote drama, but I also just don't think the humor in Western TV shows is that good, especially when they use the obnoxiously overused laugh track in comedy shows. Story-heavy video games that are not visual novels can be good, but since you have to balance gameplay and story, there could be times where you just want to know what happens next. But you have to do a gameplay segment if the story is that engaging, which can be kind of annoying. That's why I'm not surprised most mainstream games just have a minimal amount of story just to have people have the bare amount of emotional investment so they can keep playing the video game, which makes sense. However, that's just yet another reason why I stopped caring about JRPGs specifically, which used to be my favorite storytelling before anime and then visual novels. There are good potential story and character interactions that could be good, but many times you have to go through long gameplay segments and get to certain parts and sometimes backtracking all that jazz just to see the next story beat, which to me is worse than having to sit through more slow slice of life scenes in a visual novel. Don't even get me started on gacha games and them gatekeeping story progress through daily RNG. To get back to visual novels though, as said, I like that visual novels can work whether they be less than 10 hours like something like Sayano Uda or Chihiro Himakai, or something decently long like Nukatashi or Totono. Even stuff that's pretty long like Majikoi or Chaos Child, you can at least divide your reading sessions based on the in-game chapter list or the route. With of course on top of that, as I've reiterated many times, visual novels are almost guaranteed to have an ending, regardless of how long it is. One of visual novels' most prominent features is most of their stories having sex scenes, or what the visual novels developers and the community likes to call H scenes. I know H scenes can be a point of contention and probably are a big reason why many people don't even want to read visual novels, because they don't want to just have porno or hentai level sex scenes in the middle of their romance or plot heavy story. However, even if many times I just skim or outright skip H scenes, the fact that visual novels are much more willing to include sex as a storytelling device, whether wholesome or super dark, is something I tend to really appreciate. Though it's not like sex isn't in other mediums. For example, many mature Western movies and TV shows do have on-screen sex scenes. They tend to, at best, be like a minute or two and tend to not really have any character-driven dialogue. So whether you're someone who skips H scenes or reads them for your personal enjoyment, just the fact that there's the option to read sex scenes in a visual novel, whether for plot or satisfaction, I just think H scenes are generally a net positive for visual novels, especially when they're used for actual plot, like in visual novels developed by Purplesoft like Aoi and Criminal Border, or Kurupo through Nukatashi and Hentai Prison, or the really dark stuff like Totono or Euphoria. The next point is admittedly more of a selfish one, but if you wanted to use a Japanese medium to practice and learn the Japanese language, I think visual novels are overall the best in this regard. You have voice acting you can listen to, you have the text right in front of you so you can practice reading, and if you use tools like TextStractor or the more up-to-date version, LunaHook, you can get text directly from the visual novel and use that to develop digital flashcards and Anki, or just look up words through sites like jisho.org. I have a tutorial video for LunaHook software on this channel, by the way. While anime can be good for on-the-fly listening practice, there is the issue where it's mildly annoying to have to pause and go back to certain lines, and unless you're really lucky, you're most likely not going to find Japanese text subtitled anime to practice reading. Visual novels having a backlog makes things a lot easier to go back to read certain lines or listen to previous voice lines. Attempting to learn Japanese through manga or light novels is basically only good for reading, but you will not be getting voice listening practice, especially if you don't recognize a certain kanji or vocab word. Attempting to learn Japanese through Japanese video games could work, but I've noticed it's harder to get text from normal video games as there's less tools that lets you get that compared to visual novels. While I've basically been shilling visual novels this whole time, I should be fair and at least acknowledge some of the faults that I think visual novels have compared to other mediums. The first fault I would say is I generally don't think action scenes are done all that well in visual novels. While I initially touted the visual novel medium as having the best of all worlds in terms of presentation, unfortunately the medium tends to be below average at best in terms of action scenes. That's because action scenes tend to be limited to still CGs with a crap ton of narration and monologue describing what's happening. It's still possible to get emotionally invested in the fight in order to see a cool big attack happen, but I find that the buildup of each fight tends to go on way too long, and fights that rely on ghetto moving sprites just takes me out of the experience. If I wanted good action scenes, I'll just go for an anime or a Western movie. The next fault I want to talk about is distracting mediocre side gameplay. Now, earlier I mentioned that I wasn't super into full-on video games distracting from the story experience. While there are some people who consider the Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, and DanganRonpa series of visual novels, I think part of why many people, me included, love them so much is that they're one of the few cases where I think they actually integrate the gameplay with the story very well, as there's constant dialogue during each and every action you do. But that's also why I don't consider them visual novels, because more than half the experience is gameplay and a lot of the required story progression is in that gameplay. My point in this section is more to talk about visual novel-like games, where most of the experience, aka 60 to 70%, is the story, but then there's just long instances of gameplay that almost prevents it from being a visual novel, and are generally long enough to annoyingly distract me from the story. I'm talking stuff like Urawaru Mono, Baldr Sky, Zero Escape, and anything by Alice Soft. I'm also including optional minigames like the ones in Little Busters, Summer Pockets, and Symphonic Rain. You may like these gameplay elements, and hell, that's probably why some of these series are popular, but to me, if I want a visual novel for the actual novel part, having these mediocre, distracting gameplay segments just demotivates me to continue the story. The final fault is the visual novel medium's tendency to overuse the high school setting even for very serious, unique settings and stories. I get it. This is apparently a thing where Japanese workers have to get into stressful jobs right out of high school, so they tend to idolize their supposed funnest time of their life by using high school as a way to emphasize these stories. However, the Japanese-made visual novels, anime, manga, and light novels, and even some video games, I've just gotten so sick of the high school setting being overused in 90+% of these stories throughout the 20 or so years I've been experiencing Japanese-created media. There's so many stories that I think could still work if the characters were just a little outside of high school, aka they were actually at least 18 years old, aka in college or a young adult. This is admittedly one of the few times I will give particular credit to video games and Western movies and TV shows in general, as they tend to go the opposite direction, having more adult age characters as protagonists and settings. This makes some of the sex scenes in many visual novels really uncomfortable when you know that some of these characters are well underage, despite the opening game disclaimers saying otherwise, and you are expected to enjoy what's going on, which might be uncomfortable, especially if you're an adult. If visual novels were more willing to have college or adult age settings and characters, I'd love them even more than I already do, so I have to point out this issue even if it's also in every 2D fictional Japanese-made medium. But anyway, that's about all the points I have related to this video. Even if the visual novel medium has a few faults, for the most part, it tends to be by far my most preferred medium, especially these days. I love that the vast majority of visual novels have a guaranteed conclusion. They generally have the right mix of presentation, a good mix of genres for both ones that I personally like and ones that are more willing to be unique and dark. If there's romance, it's basically guaranteed to be resolved. There's lots of varying length and pacing of stories, and the ability to use the medium as a way of learning Japanese or experience stories with sex often, if that's your thing. Some people claim that the visual novel medium is dying, but I still see creative and comfy stories being put out consistently well that are still very clearly visual novels and taking advantage of the medium's strengths. I'm all in the visual novel medium for the long run, at least for the time being. And of course, we still have plenty of untranslated titles to look forward to, and at least in this day and age, and I look forward to these more than whatever weird low-effort stories are being put in AAA games and shows these days.